Hey, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, so I get a lot of messages, and a lot of people are talking about the kind of situation between Russia and Ukraine. And I covered that a little bit and giving some historical context on an earlier video where I was responding to famous YouTuber Johnny Harris, who did a video about Vladimir Putin and kind of the motivations of Russia. And you'll definitely want to check that out because I give a lot more historical context to kind of the history of Russia, especially in this geopolitical climate that they have dealt with European counterparts. And you're going to want to check that out. I'll make sure to put that linked at the end of the video as well. But you'll get more context with that. But I wanted to also make sure I share with you guys other great resources and things out there that maybe can give you more context. So kind of talked about the Russia situation, but also need to talk about the Ukrainian side and get some context there as well. Now, one of the things that gets talked about a lot when you talk about military standoffs and the potential for military conflict in the modern world is the role that nuclear weapons play. And of course, this has been an issue ever since, World War II and the use of atomic bombs and the continued atomic bomb and nuclear weapon development that has continued ever since. And a handful of nations have nuclear weapons. And there's an interesting story out there that I think it needs to get talked about. And I want to add my commentary because I want to see this. I haven't seen this yet, but from History Matters. And that is this title video, which is why did Ukraine give up its nukes, right? Because people talk about as nuclear weapons as a deterrent to war potentially, especially if you are a nation that has issues with another nation that might have nuclear weapons. So if this is a situation where Ukraine now doesn't have nuclear weapons, which is the case, what does that potentially do in conflicts, again, where a nation that doesn't has a conflict with one that does? And in the state of Ukraine, not necessarily being a part of NATO, which has nuclear weapon states, what would that mean for them? And not that we're going to talk about what that is going to mean necessarily in the current conflict, but understand a little bit of context. I want to share with you my thoughts on this and hopefully, again, give you guys more resources so you can start learning more about the situations. Because isn't that what a history is about? Isn't that what learning history is about? We'll check this out. All right, the original video link is down below. History Matters is awesome. Let's check out this video. We'll watch it together. I'll give you my commentary. And then again, if you want to add some context, have anything to add, let us know in the comments. Just make sure you're civil about it. All right, let's get started.
Most countries that have nuclear weapons went to a great deal of effort to acquire them, and so the odds of them ever willingly giving them up are pretty slim, with some notable exceptions. So when you're a brand new country like Ukraine in 1991 and you've just been handed the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and thereby a boatload of clout, why would you give it up? Why did Ukraine disarm its nuclear weapons?
Because something I guess you would, I've heard people say is, when you talk about nuclear weapons and the ability to get them, it becomes a very polarizing thing. But it's like, as a nation, especially a small nation, is it in your best interest to have nuclear weapons? And you can discuss that down below, what you think about that. And if you do have them, should you ever give them up? Should you ever give them up? And another question to add to that too is, if you should never give them up unless everybody gives them up. But then you have questions about how can you know if everybody is giving up their stuff? How do you know that people aren't lying or hiding? Or what about nukes that are unaccounted for, right? That have been lost or something, which, by the way, is a thing that has been discussed that has probably happened, right? And has happened. Anyway, so that's a question I think that is worth repeating about nukes is, as a nation, should you try to get them? And if you have them, should you ever give them up? What do you think?
So, to begin, when the USSR came down with a mild case of collapse, things like the Armed Forces Administration and its industry were mostly divided up by whatever happened to be within the nation's new borders. And for Ukraine, as well as Belarus and Kazakhstan, this meant that they got to keep the nuclear weapons that the previous Soviet government had left on their soil.
Yep.
Now,
and those nations have a lot stronger ties today, by the way, to Russia than, say, Ukraine does. You can see that in current situations where you have support, much more support, again, from Belarus. Kazakhstan being one of the ones on the more Asian side of, again, the former USSR. But very different with Ukraine than those other nations. That, again, may have more access to nuclear weapons.
When the USSR collapsed, there was a lot of discussion amongst the nuclear powers about how these new nuclear states would be treated, and importantly, how to get them to disarm. Belarus and Kazakhstan quickly made it clear that they didn't want to keep these nuclear weapons, and so they asked for help in getting rid of them. Yet, when it came to the subject of nuclear disarmament, Ukraine's new government wasn't saying much.
By the way, that's another thing that has to be discussed, is the process to get rid of nuclear weapons is an incredible one that requires a lot, again, of help. So like Kazakhstan, Belarus coming up and saying, hey, we don't want these anymore for whatever reason. We don't want it to be problematic in the future or whatever. Or we feel like we have allies that can help us if that was, that kind of thing, which they do with Russia. But yeah, so like getting help to actually dismantle those in a proper way is also something that can require a lot of help.
And it became clear that its leaders were clearly thinking of keeping them. So why didn't they? Well, the first reason was the lack of political willpower. Ukraine's economy was firmly in the toilet in 1991, and so maintaining a nuclear weapons program when people are struggling to find work,
as many Soviet republics,
there was a lot of pressure from opposition parties, the general public, and importantly the international community. And this plays into the second reason why: the United States. The Western powers had together created a series of large financial aid packages for the former Soviet states. And whilst many nations...
Yeah, they want to create allies. NATO will expand into, those regions as well. So there's always incentive. Again, they want it to be incentive. The United States wanted it to be an incentive for nations, again, like Ukraine. And again, any Soviet, former Soviet satellite state.
With no conditions on their aid, the American assistance had one caveat: no more nuclear weapons. America wanted this because it had just signed a series of nuclear disarmament treaties with the USSR, and Ukraine keeping them would have slowed any potential progress.
That makes sense.
Because nobody knew if it actually counted towards Soviet disarmament or not. The third reason was that whilst the Ukrainian government could have maintained the bombs, creating a brand new nuclear weapons program from scratch would have been very difficult.
Yeah, that takes an incredible amount of money and know-how to be able to do that. I mean, a lot of people say, it's when you look at a graph or something comparing nuclear stockpiles, right, between like the United States and Soviet Union, you'll see like in the 80s how the Soviet Union had way more than the United States. But the big criticism was that how devastating the spending of that nuclear program was for the Soviet Union, that they had to spend such a large part of their GDP or whatever to be able to maintain that, significant upper hand when it comes to having more nuclear weapons than your adversary, being the United States. But people talking about how that nuclear program was possibly a very big reason why the collapse of the Soviet Union is going to happen kind of slowly throughout the 80s. That economic strain was something they could not handle.
They'd have gotten no outside help, and leaving a bunch of nukes on the shelf for 30 years without knowing how to handle them isn't exactly safe.
Yeah.
To further make things more difficult, Ukraine didn't actually have the ability to use the weapons, since things like armament codes and the know-how for launching ICBMs was the exclusive remit of the Moscow-based armed forces.
That's totally something people don't understand about. Like, you can have a nuclear warhead, but it doesn't mean anything. You have to be able to deliver it. And if you don't have, again, like ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, rockets that can go, again, literally from continent to continent, long distance, and be able to strike with precision, then there's no point in having a nuclear weapon. Yeah, it didn't require ICBMs in World War II, but that required, slow-moving planes where you already dominate the airspace to be able to drop that. And in the modern world, that's just not going to be an efficient way of using a weapon like that if it unfortunately came to that necessity, or someone felt it came to that necessity.
And they weren't going to share. These could have been reverse engineered eventually, but again, it was a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of political capital just to upset everyone. So why even consider keeping them at all? Well, it was because owning such weapons could essentially guarantee that you'd never be invaded, since the cost for the invader would be far too high.
A deterrent to warfare, right? So a lot of people say maybe is a reason why we haven't had wars on the scales of the world wars is because nuclear weapons, are they making the world safer in a way? Because of the whole idea of mutually assured destruction, the idea that, fighting a nation fighting another nuclear nation will lead to both nations being destroyed, almost assuredly, right? Because it doesn't take many nuclear weapons, especially today's nuclear weapons, to create the type of damage that can devastate a whole country or multiple countries or the planet.
For those who lived in Ukraine, there were fierce memories of the last time such an invasion happened. The world's powers understood this concern, and so they all came to an agreement, the Budapest Memorandum. This saw the USA, Russia, and the UK all agree to mutually respect the territorial integrity of these three states in return for their nuclear disarmament. This wasn't a defensive treaty, just a promise to agree that this was Ukraine and that the powers involved wouldn't use military or economic actions to destabilize it. Okay. The Ukrainian government accepted this and that sweet aid money quite happily, because its primary concern was that the United States would use economic sanctions against it, which this treaty protected against. With the backing of Russia, whom the Ukrainian government saw as a steadfast friend. Since their only major
That's aged poorly, hasn't it?
Post-Soviet disagreement by this point was about basing rights in Crimea, which fortunately would be sorted out pretty quickly and would never ever come up again. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching, with a special thanks to my patrons, James Bizinet,
that was a joke,
Kelly
by the way, that he
Marvin
made.
Cassow, Mo.
That was a joke that he made, by the way. If you want to hear more about some context, especially with Crimea, go to the Johnny Harris response video that I did as well, which you will see linked to at the end of this video as well. All right, great little quick rundown from kind of the kings on the internet of short form, educationally, historically relevant videos, and that is History Matters. They're so great. So yeah, just a short little thing about Ukraine having nukes, again, because that gets talked about right now with current conflicts about what the role nuclear weapons could play in conflicts going forward. But kind of going back to the question that you guys can you can talk about and start discussing, comments and stuff like that, is the role of how a country should handle their own nuclear ambitions. Is something that countries should be actively going for, and not necessarily so they can use them and do it with the intent of already having plans to use them, but as a deterrent for warfare. Would it have been, I mean, looking at this situation that they talked about in the video here, with all the pros and cons or whatever about having nuclear weapons, is that something you think the Ukraine should have given up those nukes, especially if there wasn't necessarily agreements that other nations would get rid of them? Because obviously nukes still exist, and they talk about nuclear disarmament in the world, but very few nations actually will do it and have done it. So anyway, you can think about that and talk about that in that context going forward. So again, hopefully you're paying, again, a lot of attention to the historical context of world events, and not just the one that we're talking about with Russia and Ukraine right now, but in general. It seems to be such a thing that is lacking amongst people that have opinions about current conflicts, that they don't understand deeper historical context. And it's not about excusing people and their actions, but it's about being able to explain those actions and being able to understand the explanation of those actions can then bring up more honest and effective dialogue about evaluating those actions. And hopefully, if anything, that's what we can get out of this case study for history, is understanding historical context. So if you would like to see me continue to do this, again, I don't do a lot of historical events necessarily, but I am absolutely one that will try to provide ways that you can get historical context for that, because that's really important. But if you'd like to, continue to learn about this, let me know down in the comments. If you'd like to be presented with more information and more opinions from me and more context from me, if that's something you'd like to see me focus on here in the near future, rather than going through my normal kind of round of hitting lots of different topics, let me know. Maybe you're sick and tired of hearing it and you just want to hear more of the old fun stuff. I'm down with that too, whatever you all want. Anyway, again, thanks to History Matters for doing the video. The link is down below, as well as some links to some other stuff that you can interact with our community. And with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.